This question just came in. Wes, you were talking about the reliability of Scripture and the truth of it, but the fact is that there are other books that vie for the position of Scripture. So what would you say about other books like the Gospel of Thomas or the Shepherd of Hermas that some people have included in their canon lists?
Yeah, so when we're talking about what's referred to as apocryphal literature, so literature that's not within the canon of those are specifically New Testament documents. When we're talking about literature that was written, that we hear about, they're on documentaries and they're on the news. We're always discovering, quote unquote, some of these lost gospels. A few years ago, it was the gospel of Jesus' wife. A number of years ago, it was the gospel of Judas. And what's interesting is those stories sort of fizzle away. And they fizzle away for one specific reason. It's very hard to push them into the time frame when Jesus lived. In fact, if you look at the names that I talked about, and you compare them to, say, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, they fail. And they actually get the names right for different places at different times. They get the names right for 3rd century Egypt. Now, why is that? Well, because they're written in 3rd century Egypt. And the early church knew this. They knew of a lot of these documents. And when they looked at the process of assembling what we now call the New Testament, those 27 documents, and in particular, the fourfold gospel tradition, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they unequivocally said, we cannot push these into the time frame of either Jesus or someone who knew Jesus. We just can't. And even some of the ones that had more of a viability. You mentioned the Shepherd of Hermas. The Shepherd of Hermas, if there was any book that was going to make it into the New Testament, it was the Shepherd of Hermas. Now, the Shepherd of Hermas isn't actually a fanciful gospel that tells wild stories of Jesus that you don't find in the Bible. It's actually relatively tame in its actual description. But we have an early canonical list called the Muratorium Fragment, which there's a debate as to when it's dated, but I would contend it's somewhere in the middle to late 2nd century. And it talks about the Shepherd of Hermas, and it says this is a popular book. This is an orthodox book in the sense that it has very familiar teaching of the church as a whole. But we know who Hermas is. We know when he lived. In fact, it says his brother was the Bishop of Rome at the time. And they say this is not a book that we can push to either someone who knew Jesus or someone who knew Jesus. And when we're talking about specifically the New Testament, if I want to know who Jesus is, I'm going to go to the earliest sources that talk about his life, like I would with anything else. If I wanted to know about Abraham Lincoln, I'm not going to go to sources that are written hundreds of years later. I'm going to go to the first-hand sources to find out about his life. And when we're talking about Jesus, the only documents that come from the time frame of Jesus or someone who knew Jesus, I would argue, are specifically Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but also the 27 books that we call the New Testament. The other ones, although they might be interesting to read and look at, they just don't fit the criteria of the right time period.